This is the Constellation class cruiser, a design which entered service during the 2280s, also known as the movie era by fans of Star Trek. We don't really know much about the ship's background canonically, but if you've seen my video on the class, then you know that I consider the ship to be a backup to the Excelsior, designed and constructed in the event that that design's prototype failed in its mission to achieve much higher speeds. In that context, it seems that the Excelsior was eventually a success, breaking all kinds of speed records and ushering in a new era for Starfleet ship design language, which would last for many decades, with many classes entering service based on the success of that design and what it achieved and represented. So given that the Excelsior was not a failure, does that mean that the Constellation class was? Well, probably not. After all, if your backup proves unnecessary, you achieved success and can focus on Plan A, while Plan B goes by the wayside with no real bad feelings. That's not what we're talking about here today, though. No. I'm wondering if an argument can't be made that the Constellation class was a failure in service, as in, once it got into service, regardless of the long shadow cast by the Excelsior, it was a failure. It was not successful, standing on its own 2 feet, or 4 nacelles. Now, as stated at the beginning of the video, we don't really know much about this ship in canon, less than most ships in Trek at least, which isn't much, as the background and capabilities of the ships of the universe is really seldom on the minds of the showrunners and writers of the various Trek series. And even when it is, and some hard information is put down, it's usually totally useless and in fact, in many cases, downright contradicts information stated elsewhere, which is incredibly unhelpful. For instance, all we really know about the Constitution refit class is that it was a refit of the original Constitution, that apparently didn't have many of the same components as the original Connie. And we know nothing else after that. We know a little bit more about the Constitution, that it was a heavy cruiser produced at some point already in service by the time of the Next Generation, that Enterprise had other captains, so it was kind of older, but we don't know, like, when it entered service, what its max speed was officially, yada yada yada. Back on topic, I and many others consider the ship, we're back to the Constellation, to be a backup to the Excelsior. It experienced several setbacks during its lengthy development, the Excelsior did, and the Constellation was attempting to match the expected or desired performance of Excelsior, using only components already in service in other ships or current generation technologies, so reactors, computers, sensors, and weapons that already existed, rather than building something from scratch that was totally new. In pursuit of this goal, the Constellation would have 4 nacelles, which each nacelle could be linked to the others aboard the ship, and they could be swapped while the ship was at warp, and this would permit the design to maintain this high speed, and give each nacelle time to cool off and refresh after being used at high speed. So you use one pair of nacelles to race around at warp 9, and then once those nacelles are getting tired, you take the one that's the most tired, and you retire it, you swap in another nacelle, a third, you run it, and then when the second nacelle starts getting, needs a break, then you swap it for the 4th nacelle, run that, and then you're back to the first, and yada yada yada. And so this is where the main argument for the ship being a failure comes from, as the outdated technology that was used caused a lot of limitations to be placed on the resultant class. The Constellation was able to swap nacelles while at warp, though she'd have to come down to lower speeds for a swap to be safely performed, so she couldn't just go at high warp speed forever, unlike Excelsior, because her older nacelles couldn't handle that level of power for as long. This issue and a very complicated drive system by the standards of the day, basically you have double everything and that massively increases the complexity, Uh, it would lead to them having a lot of issues, basically. Engineering and wouldn't really be fond of their ships due to the high workload that they had placed on them. Basically, unlike older ships or newer ships, you had way more to do because you had twice as much to do, and you probably didn't have an engineering department that was twice as big. And so, although these issues could have been overlooked and worked around if the Excelsior had failed basically as a, well, I mean, it works, and it's better than that dumpster fire design that we threw away after wasting a lot of time on. But because Excelsior was a success, Starfleet found itself unwilling to support a large fleet of the ships despite their using readily available technology and equipment. Basically, that if the design had been a little bit better, you wouldn't have needed to not build as many. That basically, yeah, okay, great, Excelsior is good, but if Constellation had also been good, then you could have maybe built fewer Excelsiors and saved some resources, and you could have built more Constellations, because they have similar capabilities. But because the Constellation was finicky and overcomplicated and yada yada yada, you didn't build that many of them for that reason. So, to wrap things up, I don't think that the Constellation was a failure, though. Yes, she had some limitations, which made her compare unfavorably to Excelsior, but these were very much due to the fact that she used just older technology. And yeah, not that many of the ships were built, but that was because with the Excelsior class being eventually successful, Starfleet no longer had a need for the ship, as even if the class hadn't had the aforementioned issues, Excelsior was just newer and more capable on the whole. Because her components were brand new, they had a longer life ahead of them of usability, whereas Constellation, making use of components from the last or current generation, their time was already ticking. They had already had their peak years of usefulness and modernity. So that meant that you would be really tying yourself with this sort of outdated from the start design. So therefore, I think that it made sense to switch over to Excelsior, that was the right decision, and that not building the Constellation was the right call. Because, yeah, it used current generation technology, and that meant that you could get next level performance if you were willing to deal with all of these inefficiencies. But hey, you have the new hotness, so why would you bother with that old one? It's a little bit like, yeah, you could make a go-kart that could do 150 miles an hour, and it would probably work. You could get different go-kart engines together, yada, 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 yada. But also, you could just, buy a faster car and get up to 150, and it would be less finicky in the long run. You could build a faster airplane by just tacking on more engines. You could have 8 of these existing engines that you have, and they're available, and it might go faster, but it's going to use more fuel, it's going to be more complicated, yada, yada, yada. Or you could just design one new engine and do the same thing. That kind of argument applies, just in future in space. So what do you think about this idea about the design being a failure? What do you think of the Constellation generally? It's probably my favorite Starfleet ship design. Probably. Maybe not yours, but definitely let me know what you think about it. As always, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. There is a Patreon. Being a Patreon member gets you access to videos early. It lets you vote on some of the videos that are going to appear on the channel and what order they're going to appear, so that's really cool. There's a couple of other benefits. I mean, really, I think that's about all I've got so far. So, yeah. Have a nice day. Hope you enjoyed the video. Bye.